Every morning she fed the chickens in the yard, and every day the quiet Duke watched her. The grain slipped through her fingers before the sun had fully decided to rise. Elena Marsh moved through the chicken yard the way she moved through most of life, quietly, purposefully, without asking the world to look at her. The hens pressed around her boots in a rushing, bobbing crowd, their wings half open with excitement, their small claws scratching at the cold, hard earth. She scattered the grain in wide arcs, and they chased each little piece, as though it were the last one they would ever see. She did not smile at them. She did not talk to them the way some people did. She simply fed them, because they needed feeding, and because she had promised herself, a long time ago, in a different kind of life, that she would always do the things that needed to be done, even when no one was watching. The estate was called Aldenmere. It sat on the edge of a slow valley in the north of England, where the hills curved like sleeping shoulders, and the mornings came in cold and gray for most of the year. The great house stood at the top of a long, rising lawn, and the outbuildings, the kitchen gardens, the stables, and the chicken yard sat lower down, arranged with the practical modesty of things that existed to serve rather than impress. Elena's cottage was at the far eastern end of the property, pressed against a stone wall where ivy grew so thick it had crept over one of the windows, and no one had yet done anything about it. She had been at Aldenmere for almost 2 years. She had come in the winter, the kind of winter that does not apologize, after her mother died, and left her with little money, a few debts, and a strong feeling that she could not remain in the town where everything she looked at reminded her of grief. Her uncle, a man named Bernard who managed the estate's lower grounds, had written to her carefully. He had said there was work, if she wanted it. He had not said it was easy work, or well-paying work, or the kind of work a woman her age might have imagined for herself. He had simply said, there is work. And Elena, who had always respected honesty more than comfort, had packed her things and come. She was 31 years old. She had dark brown hair that she kept braided or pinned, strong hands, and a way of being still in a room that made some people feel calm and other people feel slightly uneasy, as if they were not sure what she was thinking. She was not unfriendly. She smiled when something genuinely deserved a smile, and she laughed, really laughed, when something was truly funny, which was rarer than it should have been. She had been married briefly, in her mid-20s, to a man named George Marsh, who had been kind to her in the beginning, and then, slowly and without drama, had drifted into an unhappiness that he took out, not on her directly, but on everything around her, so that the air in their small house eventually felt too heavy to breathe. He had died of a fever 2 years after they separated. She grieved for him, not for what their marriage had been, but for the man she had believed he might become. She kept his name because changing it required paperwork and energy that she had decided to spend on other things. She finished scattering the grain and stood for a moment with the empty pail swinging from her hand. The hens settled around her in a busy, self-satisfied way. One of them, a large, bad-tempered bird that Elena had privately named Constance, stood apart from the others and regarded her with deep suspicion, as she always did. Elena looked back at her steadily. Constance blinked. Neither of them moved. Then a younger hen pushed between them looking for stray grain, and the moment broke, and Elena turned and lifted the latch on the yard gate and walked back toward the cottage. The air smelled of frost and damp earth, and something she had never been able to name, a smell that belonged specifically to this property, to this corner of the valley, as though the land itself had a particular scent that it released only at this hour. She breathed it in. She carried the empty pail back to the shed, hung it on its hook, and went inside to heat water for tea. She did not know about the window yet. The Duke of Aldenmere had not wanted to come home. His name was Charles Wentworth, and he had spent the previous 4 years moving between cities with the concentrated restlessness of a man who is trying very hard not to think about something. He had been in Florence for a year, then in Vienna, then briefly in a village in the south of France where the light was beautiful, and the silence was even worse than the noise had been. He had returned to London twice, each time telling himself it was for practical reasons, business matters, meetings with his solicitors, a brief period attending to the estate's accounts from a distance, and both times he had stayed no longer than a few weeks before the city's gray skies and his own reflection in hotel windows had driven him back out again. He was 42 years old. He was not a man who liked to describe himself or be described, which made it difficult, even in the telling, because he resisted the kind of language that wraps a person neatly in a few sentences. He was tall, though he carried himself as if he would have preferred to be less noticeable. He had dark eyes that were careful more than warm, a habit of long silence that people often mistook for coldness, and hands that were always slightly ink-stained because he wrote letters, many letters, though most of them were never sent. He had been a good son, a capable landowner, a loyal friend to the few people he trusted deeply, and a terrible widower, by which is meant simply that grief had found him unable to adapt to it with any grace. His wife had been a woman named Clara. She had died 3 years ago, in the spring, from an illness that moved quickly and gave very little warning. They had been married for 11 years. He had loved her with the kind of love that is not dramatic, but is instead very deep and very constant, like water under rock, present always, even when invisible. When she died, he had not collapsed publicly, or wept in front of anyone. He had simply stood beside her grave in the Aldenmere churchyard while the minister spoke, and held his hands at his sides, and looked at the ground, and understood with absolute clarity that something essential had been removed from the architecture of his life, and that everything which remained would now lean differently. He had closed up the great house. He had paid the staff to maintain it. He had left. He came back in October, 2 years after Elena had arrived. He came back, not because he had decided he was ready, but because his solicitor had written to him 3 times in as many months about decisions that needed to be made in person, and because his sister, a sharp-minded woman named Dorothy, had come to see him in Vienna and had looked at the room he was living in, the sparseness of it, the lack of any personal objects, the single cup on the shelf, and had said to him, very quietly, "Charles, you are not living here. You are waiting," and the accuracy of it had made him too uncomfortable to stay. He arrived at Aldenmere on a Tuesday in mid-October. The housekeeper, a capable and tactful woman named Mrs. Hobbs, had arranged for fires to be lit in the rooms he used most, and for the kitchen to be stocked, and for everything to appear as normal as possible, though she had worked for him for many years, and knew that normal at Aldenmere had not looked like anything in particular for quite some time. He walked through the ground-floor rooms slowly, touching nothing, taking in the familiar arrangements of furniture and light. The house smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the particular dry, cold smell of rooms that have been aired but not lived in. He went upstairs. He went to his study, a large, book-lined room at the corner of the east wing, with 2 tall windows that faced in different directions, one looking down the valley toward the village, and one looking down the sloping grounds toward the kitchen gardens and the lower outbuildings. He stood at this second window for a long time. The evening was coming in fast, the way autumn evenings do, pulling the light down quickly, as if it had somewhere more important to be. Below, the grounds were empty. The kitchen garden was bare and brown. The paths between the outbuildings were quiet. He could see the low stone wall of the chicken yard in the distance, though at this hour it was just a dark edge against the grass. He turned away. He went to bed early, slept badly, and rose before 5 the next morning with the disoriented feeling of a man who does not yet know where he is. He went back to the study. He lit the lamp on the desk. He opened a folder of papers from his solicitor and stared at them without reading them. Then, because the room was quiet, and the lamp was making his eyes tired, and the window was showing the first pale suggestion of gray light at the horizon, he looked outside. That was when he saw her. She was crossing the lawn below, not quickly, not slowly, just walking, with a pail in one hand, and a grain bag slung over her opposite shoulder. She wore a long dark coat and heavy boots, and had her hair up, and she moved through the cold morning air, with a kind of steadiness that was unusual. Most people, he had noticed over a lifetime, moved through the world with some visible sense of urgency or worry or self-consciousness, as if they were aware of being observed or judged or hurried. This woman did not seem to feel any of that. She walked as if the morning were hers and she were welcome in it. He watched her open the gate of the chicken yard. He watched the hens rush to her. He watched her scatter the grain in those wide, easy arcs, and stand for a moment after, just being still. He could not see her face at this distance, only her outline, the movement of her hands, the shape of her in the cold morning light. He stood at the window until she left the yard and disappeared toward the outbuildings, and then he stood a little longer, looking at the empty yard where the hens were still busy at the grain. He did not ask Mrs. Hobbs about her that day. He went downstairs, ate his breakfast alone, met with his estate manager to begin the dreary work of catching up, and spent the afternoon in the study reading documents. But that evening, when the light failed and the grounds went dark below, he noticed something he had not expected to notice. He was looking forward to the morning. It was such a small, quiet thing, such an ordinary thing, that he almost did not notice it at all. But it was there, underneath all the tiredness and the difficulty of being back in this house, underneath the weight of things he had carried for 3 years. There was something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like mild anticipation. He did not examine it. He put the papers away, ate the supper Mrs. Hobbs left outside his study door, and went to sleep at a reasonable hour. In the morning, before the sky had decided what color it was going to be, he was at the window again. She came at the same time. She came the same way. She wore the same dark coat and the same heavy boots, and carried the same pail, and the hens surrounded her with the same greedy devotion, and she stood in the same still way after scattering the grain. And something about the repetition of it, the fact that this was a thing she did every day, dependably, in the cold, before the world was properly awake, moved him in a way he could not articulate, and did not try to. He watched her for 11 mornings before he finally, almost reluctantly, asked Mrs. Hobbs who she was. Mrs. Hobbs told him. She said her name was Elena Marsh. She said she was Bernard the grounds manager's niece. She said she had come to the estate 2 winters ago after losing her mother, and had proved to be very reliable with the animals and a good worker generally, and that the kitchen staff liked her very much, and that she kept herself to herself without being unfriendly, which Mrs. Hobbs considered a sign of good character. He thanked her and said nothing more. That night he sat in his chair by the fire, not the one in his study but the one in the smaller sitting room, which had been Clara's favorite, and he thought about what Mrs. Hobbs had told him. He thought about the phrase she had used, keeps herself to herself. He understood that. He had spent 4 years doing it, in a dozen different rooms in a dozen different cities, and he recognized it for what it was. Not coldness, but the reasonable response of a person who has been hurt, and is being careful about the distance they allow between themselves and the world. He did not know if Elena Marsh had been hurt. He knew nothing about her beyond what Mrs. Hobbs had said. He had not seen her face clearly. He had only watched her from a window, every morning for nearly 2 weeks, feeding her chickens in the cold. And yet, he looked at the fire for a long time. The house was quiet around him in the way that large, old, mostly empty houses are quiet, a sound that is almost the sound of all the past years still living in the walls. He thought about Clara, the way he did most evenings, though lately the thinking had changed slightly in character. It was less like pain now and more like memory, which was not the same thing. Pain wants something from you. Memory simply sits with you. He thought about the morning, the next morning, the one that was already coming, and that small, quiet feeling was there again. It was not much, it was barely anything, but it was real, and it was his, and in 3 years of mostly gray days it was the first thing that had felt like it might possibly, eventually, lead to something. He did not know what that something was. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in months, and in the morning, long before the sky turned pale, he was already awake, and already moving toward the window. The mornings had a pattern now, and Elena had begun to depend on it. She did not know, of course, that someone was watching. She was simply aware, as she had always been aware, because awareness was one of the habits she had built carefully around herself, the way you build a wall not to keep the world out, but to know exactly where the world is, that the first hour of the day belonged entirely to her. The chickens, the cold, the grain, the particular silence that sat over the grounds before the estate came to life. These things were hers, in a way that nothing else at Aldenmere was, because the rest of the day involved other people, other needs, other tasks, that required her to be useful rather than simply present. She did not want much. She had decided this about herself some time ago. She had wanted, once, the ordinary things, a home, a partnership, a life that moved steadily forward in the way people described a good life moving. But the ordinary things had not held together the way they were supposed to, and she had rebuilt herself on simpler foundations. She wanted to be reliable. She wanted to be competent. She wanted, at the end of each day, to feel that she had done what she said she would do, without drama or complaint. These were small ambitions, and she knew that some people would have considered them a kind of defeat. She did not feel defeated. She felt, most days, very clear. Bernard had given her more responsibility over the autumn months. He was a good man, her uncle, patient with the land in the way that only people who have worked land for decades can be, and quiet in the way that she was quiet, which meant they suited each other's company without requiring much of it. He had given her charge of the chickens completely, and of the 2 kitchen gardens on the lower grounds, and of the small greenhouse where Mrs. Hobbs grew the herbs and winter greens for the house. In return, she was given the cottage, her meals, and a wage that was modest but reliable. It was enough. She had stopped requiring more than enough some years ago. The morning in question, the morning that would turn out to be different, though Elena did not know it yet, began like all the others. She woke at 4:45, when the darkness was still total, and the cold inside the cottage was almost the same temperature as the cold outside it. She dressed without lighting the lamp, because she had done it so many times that her hands knew the order of things without needing light to guide them. She put on her heaviest wool socks, her work trousers, a thick undershirt, and the long dark coat with the deep pockets that had belonged to her mother and was 3 sizes too large for her, and was the warmest thing she owned. She laced her boots. She braided her hair, with 4 efficient movements, and pinned it without a mirror. Outside, the darkness was softening. The sky above the valley was just beginning to shift from black to a deep, dense blue, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it but is very beautiful. Her breath came out in clouds as she crossed from the cottage door to the shed to collect the grain pail and the morning measure of feed. She could hear the hens already, their soft, low murmuring from inside the coop, the sound of them waking themselves up and settling their feathers and preparing, with the focused enthusiasm of creatures whose whole joy is in eating, for the moment she would arrive. She liked them. She would not have said so, because saying so seemed slightly excessive, but she did like them. She liked their complete lack of concern about anything beyond the immediate physical facts of their existence. She liked the way they had very distinct personalities, Constance with her magnificent bad temper, and a small pale hen she had come to think of as Pearl, who was always slightly late to everything, and a group of 3 identical brown hens who moved together so consistently that she had given up trying to tell them apart, and simply thought of them collectively as the 3. She liked the way the young ones, born in the spring, still approached every morning as though it were a surprise. She opened the coop door and stood back, and they came out in their rushing, bobbing way, and she scattered the grain and they spread across the yard in search of it, and she stood with her hands now empty, watching them, and thought about the greenhouse. There was a section of the winter greens she needed to look at today, because some of the leaves had been showing a yellowing at the edges that might mean something, and might mean nothing, but that she wanted to check before Bernard asked about it. She was thinking about this, about leaves and nitrogen, and what Bernard had said last season about the soil in that particular bed, when a sound made her turn. It was not a large sound. It was the soft, specific sound of a boot on frosted gravel, coming from the direction of the formal garden, which lay on the other side of a low yew hedge, 30 feet north of the chicken yard. She turned. She looked. She saw nothing. The hedge was solid and dark, and the morning was still dim enough that the garden beyond it was in deep shadow. The sound did not repeat. One of the hens wandered close to the gate and pressed its beak against the slats, considering escape, and Elena moved to redirect it without thinking about it. She went back to watching the hens. She did not think about the sound again for the rest of the morning. But later, much later, when she was turning soil in the second garden bed, and her mind was not occupied with anything in particular, it came back to her, the specific quality of it. A footstep on gravel, careful and unhurried, coming from a part of the grounds that nobody had reason to visit before 6 in the morning. She put the thought down and covered it with other things. She was good at that. In the great house, behind the tall casement window of the East Wing study, the Duke of Aldenmuir had made a kind of domestic architecture of his watching. He did not call it watching. He would not have used that word if asked, because it suggested something uncomfortable, something with an edge of intrusion or obsession that did not describe what he felt. What he felt was simpler. He was simply glad to be awake early, which had always suited him, and glad to have a view that contained something worth looking at. That was all it was, he told himself, and on some mornings he almost believed it. But the truth, the more honest truth that he kept away from with the practiced skill of a man who had long been good at not examining himself too closely, was that in the 3 weeks since his return to Aldenmuir, the morning window was the only part of his day that he approached without dread. The rest of the day was difficult. The house was full of Clara. Not literally. He did not see her, did not hear her, was not that kind of man, and it was not that kind of grief. But every room had been arranged by her hands, and the light fell in at angles she had chosen, and the books on the shelves were in the order she had put them, and the small decisions about what went where, and what hung above which fireplace were all hers, and so the house was full of her decisions, which was almost the same as being full of her. He was managing. He did the work his solicitor needed him to do. He met with his estate manager, a capable, bearded man named Geoffrey who had been running the practical life of Aldenmere throughout his absence, and who updated him on everything without judgment or sentiment, which he deeply appreciated. He ate his meals, he replied to letters, he took long walks in the afternoon, when the light allowed, choosing the routes that went away from the formal garden and the churchyard, and the other places that pressed too hard. He was managing, but managing is not the same as living, and he knew the difference. The window was different. The window was the one part of his day that felt clean. He was there before she arrived each morning. He was in his chair first, reading or trying to read by lamplight, and then when the sky began to pale he moved to the window, and he waited, and she came. The timing varied by a few minutes on either side, depending on the morning, and in those few minutes of waiting he was aware of something he recognized, an attention, an aliveness, an anticipation, that he had not felt in a very long time. She came across the lawn, and the hens came out of the coop, and she scattered the grain, and she stood still after, in that particular way she had of standing, not restless, not absent, but just there, fully present in the cold morning, in a way that seemed to him remarkable. Then she lifted the gate latch and went back toward the shed, and the morning was over in that sense, and he turned back to his papers. He had, by this point, formed a clear picture of her in his mind, though he was aware that a clear picture formed entirely from a distance was not the same as knowing someone. He knew her shape, her movement, the particular set of her shoulders when she walked. He knew that she was unhurried in a world that was almost always hurried. He knew that she was good with the animals, not in the performing, look how gentle I am way, but in the functional, matter-of-fact way of someone who understands that animals need feeding and not performing to. He did not know her face. At this distance, in this light, he could not see her face. He had begun, in the evenings, to find excuses to extend his time in the study. He told himself it was because the study was the warmest room. He told himself it was because his writing materials were there. He wrote letters in the evenings, real ones, intended to be sent, to his solicitors, to Geoffrey about the Eastfield drainage, to Dorothy in London, who replied with characteristic efficiency, and the occasional dry observation that made him smile. He did not write to anyone about the woman who fed the chickens. There was nothing to write. There was nothing to say. He watched her from a window every morning and felt more like a person than he had in 3 years, and that was not the kind of thing you wrote in a letter. One evening, as November settled its cold hands firmly over the valley, he was in the study when the sound of footsteps in the corridor told him Mrs. Hobbs was doing her last round of the house before retiring. He listened to her footsteps go past the study door, pause, and then continue. A moment later there was a quiet knock. He called for her to come in. She stood in the doorway with a small tray, a cup of tea, a piece of shortbread. She had been doing this every evening without being asked, which was one of the many things he appreciated about her. She set the tray on the edge of the desk. He said, without looking up from the letter he was reading, "How many people live in the lower cottages now?" She told him. There were 4 cottages in use. Bernard lived in the largest one with his wife. The stable hand, a young man named Owen, lived in the smallest. A woman named Margaret, who helped in the kitchen garden in the warm months and had nowhere else to go, lived in the 3rd. And Bernard's niece, Elena Marsh, lived in the cottage at the end, the one with the ivy over the east window. He nodded. He asked how long Bernard's niece had been on the property. Mrs. Hobbs told him, 2 years, since January of the year before last. He said nothing further. Mrs. Hobbs, who had worked for him long enough to know when a silence was the end of a question, and not the beginning of the next one, wished him a good evening, and left. He sat with the tea cooling beside him, and thought about 2 years. She had been here 2 years. He had been absent for more than that, and she had arrived while he was gone, and so she had no memory of Aldenmere, as it had been when Clara was alive. She knew only this version of it, the quieter, emptier version, the house with the curtains half drawn, and the rooms partly closed, and the Duke absent indefinitely. She had made her place in it, without knowing its other shape. Perhaps that was easier. Or perhaps it did not matter at all, and he was looking for significance in something that was simply a set of coincidences relating to a woman he had seen from a window and could not pick out in a crowd. He drank the tea. He ate the shortbread. He put the letters away and sat for a while in the lamplight, and then he put the lamp out and went to bed. In the morning, the sky was a very pale yellow at the eastern edge when he took his position at the window. The yard below was still. Frost had settled across the grass in a thin, bright layer. He could see his own breath against the cold glass. Then she came around the corner of the outbuilding, with her pail and her coat and her unhurried way, and the hens heard her before she opened the coop, and their noise rose up from inside the wood and straw, and she let them out, and the yard became briefly busy and bright with their movement, and he stood at the window and watched, and thought, I should like very much to know what she thinks about, standing there like that. He did not know how to make that happen. He did not know if it was a thing that could happen, given the particular arrangements of their lives and their differences in situation, and the fact that he was her employer, not directly, but in the significant sense that everything she ate and everywhere she slept was provided by the estate he owned. He did not know if he was the kind of man who could want something like this, or if wanting something like this was simply the first sign that grief was beginning to ease, and that what he was feeling had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with simply being ready, after a very long time, to feel something again. He did not know. He was not sure he wanted to know. She stood in the yard until the grain was finished, and then she left, and the hens settled, and the morning resumed its ordinary quiet. He stood at the window a moment longer than usual, watching the yard where she had been, and then he turned back to his desk and his papers and the long, careful work of being ordinary. Bernard Marsh was the kind of man who noticed things and said very little about them, which had made him a good groundskeeper for 30 years, and a reasonably comfortable person to live beside. He noticed, in the third week of November, that his niece had stopped sleeping as deeply as she usually did. He did not know this from any conversation with her. Elena was not a person who mentioned her sleep, but from the small evidence of early morning sounds that carried between the thin stone walls of the cottage row. He woke at 4:30 himself most mornings, and he had learned the sounds of the property the way a sailor learns the sounds of his ship. Which creak meant what, which silence was normal and which was not. Elena's cottage was at the far end of the row, a good 50 feet from his own, but the valley funneled sound in particular directions, and on still mornings he could hear her door open and close. She had begun opening it earlier. Not much earlier. 20 minutes perhaps. Perhaps 30. But the timing had shifted, quietly, without explanation, and Bernard noticed it and filed it away, in the practical section of his mind, where he kept things he observed, but had not yet decided what to do with. He did not think it was a problem. Elena was a composed woman. She was not the kind of person who fell apart quietly. If she was waking early, there was probably a reason, and when the reason was relevant to him she would tell him, and when it was not she wouldn't, and this arrangement had worked well between them for 2 years, and he saw no need to disturb it. What he could not have known, because he could not have seen it from where he lived, was that the thing pulling his niece out of sleep, and out of her cottage, a half-hour earlier than before, was nothing more alarming than curiosity. Elena did not call it that. She called it attentiveness to the animals, which was true in its way, because the young hens in particular were going through a period of adjustment that required slightly more supervision. But the deeper truth, the truth that sat underneath the practical one like a stone under shallow water, visible when the light hit it right, was that she had become increasingly aware of the upper window of the east wing, and increasingly interested in whether it was lit. Some mornings it was not. The window was dark, the curtains drawn, and nothing distinguished it from any other window on the face of the house. On those mornings, the yard felt a little larger and a little quieter than usual, and she noticed that her thoughts moved through it more slowly, without the same quality of alertness. Other mornings, and these were the mornings she had begun to rise earlier for, though she had not yet admitted this to herself with any precision, the window was lit, just barely. The light behind the curtain was golden and very faint, like the light of a lamp rather than daylight, and it meant that someone in that room was awake before the sun was, which was unusual in a house the size of Aldenmere, where most of the staff rose at 5 and the family, which was now, she understood, simply the Duke, had no particular obligation to be awake before breakfast. But there it was. Some mornings, the light. She fed the chickens as she always did. She did not look at the window while she was doing it. She was careful about this in the same way she was careful about many things. Not from self-consciousness exactly, but from a sense that some things ought to remain unacknowledged until you had decided what they meant. She had not decided what it meant. She finished her morning work, returned the pail to its hook, and went back to the cottage to change her boots before going to the greenhouse, where the yellowing leaves in the second bed had not improved, and might in fact have worsened. She studied them for 20 minutes, poking at the soil around the roots, and thinking carefully about what she knew and what she did not know. And then she went to find Bernard. He was in the stable yard, speaking with Owen about the drainage in the corner paddock. She waited until they had finished, and then she described what she had seen in the greenhouse. Bernard listened with the particular patience of a man who was thinking while being spoken to. He asked 2 questions. He nodded. He said, "I think it is the lime. I think that bed has gone alkaline again. Do you remember what we did 2 autumns ago?" She did not, because 2 autumns ago she had not yet arrived. She said so. He said, "We will fix it this week." She nodded. She turned to go. Bernard said, without particular emphasis and without looking at her, "The Duke has been back almost a month now." She stopped. She turned back. She said, "Yes." Bernard said, "He seems to be managing." She said, "I would not know. I have not seen him." Bernard looked at her with the mild, observant eyes of a man who had noticed many things and planned to say very little about any of them. He said, "No, but you have seen the house, and you know when a house has someone in it." She thought about this. She said, "Yes, it is different." "Different how?" Bernard asked, and she could hear in the question that he was genuinely curious, not probing. She thought for a moment. She said, "It has more weight to it now, like when you add a stone to a still pond. The surface does not look different, but everything shifts a little." Bernard looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded slowly and said nothing more, and she went back to the greenhouse and thought about lime and soil acidity and tried to stop thinking about windows. The discovery that the great house had a new occupant had changed the dynamics of the estate's communal life in ways that were small but real. The kitchen was busier. Mrs. Hobbs had reinstated the full breakfast service and the evening meal. The housemaids who had been on reduced hours came back to their full schedules. Owen the stable hand spent more time on the horses, because the Duke rode regularly now. Elena had seen him in the distance twice, crossing the upper field on a gray horse at a pace that suggested he was going somewhere rather than simply exercising. The whole property had a different rhythm now, the rhythm of a place with a purpose, rather than simply a place in waiting. Elena moved through these changes, the way she moved through most things, by adapting without drama. The kitchen being busier meant that Mrs. Hobbs sometimes needed the herbs earlier than usual, and so Elena adjusted the greenhouse schedule accordingly. Owen being occupied with the horses more frequently meant that some of the lower fencing work fell to her and Bernard, which was fine, because the work was straightforward, and Bernard's company was restful. What she had not adjusted for, what she was not sure how to adjust for, was the growing feeling that her mornings had acquired an audience. She had no proof of this. She had seen nothing more definitive than a faint light behind a curtain. She had heard one set of footsteps on gravel, on one morning, and they had not repeated. She had no reason, in any concrete sense, to believe that the Duke of Aldenmere had any interest in the lower grounds before breakfast. And yet, she thought about it while she was pruning the dormant rose canes along the south garden wall one Tuesday afternoon. The afternoon light was flat and gray, and the cold had settled into her fingers in a way that required gloves, which she had forgotten. She worked without them, because going back for them felt like giving in, and she thought about what she actually knew, versus what she had added to it herself. What she knew. There was sometimes a light in the east wing study window in the early morning. She could see this window clearly from the chicken yard, because the yard faced north, and the window faced southeast, and there was nothing between them but open lawn and cold air. What she had added to it herself, the idea that the light was connected to her. The idea that the footstep on the gravel had been someone coming close to look. The idea that any of it was related to her at all, rather than to the natural rhythms of a man who had recently returned to his home and was getting used to it. She put the pruning shears down for a moment and looked at her reddened fingers. She was, she thought, constructing a story from very thin materials. She was taking 2 or 3 coincidental details and turning them into something that reflected her own state of mind more than any external reality. She had been on the estate for 2 years. She had lived quietly and worked well, and not required anything from anyone beyond the basic arrangements of her employment. She was 31 years old, and she lived alone in a cottage at the end of a row, and she had not, she realized, spoken to anyone outside the estate in almost 4 months. This was not a complaint. It was an observation. She was observing herself the way she observed the hens, with a practical, unsentimentally affectionate attention. She was lonely. Not devastatingly so. Not the kind of loneliness that breaks through the surface and demands to be addressed. The kind of loneliness that settles in around the edges of a life and becomes so familiar that you stop calling it loneliness and start calling it simply the shape of things. She picked up the pruning shears. She went back to the rose canes. On a Friday morning in late November, it rained. Not the gentle, misty rain of autumn that softened everything and made the valley look like a painting of itself, but a hard, driven, purposeful rain that came in from the west with the wind behind it and hit the windows of the great house and the windows of the cottages with the same democratic enthusiasm. Elena fed the chickens in it anyway. She wore her coat with its deep pockets and kept her head down and worked quickly, because the hens did not like the rain and made their feelings known with great clarity and volume, and the faster she moved, the sooner everyone, herself included, could find shelter. She was returning the pail to the shed, water dripping from the brim of the old cap she had found hanging inside the door, and commandeered for exactly this kind of morning, when she heard a voice. It was not a voice she recognized. It was deep and measured, and came from somewhere close, and her first impression was that she had been speaking out loud without realizing it, which was not something she ever did. She stopped. She looked up. He was standing on the path between the formal garden and the outbuildings, perhaps 15 feet from her. He was wearing a long riding coat, dark with rain, and he had the slightly startled look of a man who had not expected to see another person either. She knew who he was. Of course she knew who he was. She had seen him from a distance twice on the horse. She had seen his signature on the quarterly terms of her employment. She had never been this close to him. He said, "I beg your pardon, I did not see you there." His voice was steady, even in its surprise. He spoke the way she would have expected a man of his situation to speak, clearly, correctly, but without the particular edge some men of his situation put into their voices, the edge that said, "I am speaking to you, and you should appreciate it." She said, "No, sir, I apologize. I should have heard you coming." He said, "You shouldn't have needed to. This is your path as much as mine in the morning." She did not know what to say to that. It was such an unusual thing for him to say. She looked at him for a moment, properly, for the first time, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a second that stretched out slightly longer than a normal second. He said, "You are Bernard's niece, Elena Marsh." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am told you manage the chickens and the lower gardens." She said, "Yes." He said, "I noticed the greenhouse, the second bed. Mrs. Hobbs mentioned it to me yesterday. Bernard tells me you identified the lime problem." She said, "Bernard identified it. I only noticed the leaves." He looked at her with a small, precise shift of expression, something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same direction as one. He said, "Noticing the leaves was the first step." She said, "Yes." The rain continued to fall between them, and around them, and the hens inside the coop were still complaining at volume, and they stood on the path for another moment, and then he said, "Don't let me keep you from the shelter," and she thanked him, and he nodded, and they went in separate directions, as people whose lives run on parallel tracks always do. She went back to the cottage. She sat down with her wet coat still on, and her wet cap in her hands, and she was breathing slightly faster than the short distance home would explain. She sat there for a long time. He had known her name. The broken gate was Bernard's fault, though he would not have said so himself. He had noticed the loose hinge 2 weeks before, in mid-November, when the gate of the chicken yard had begun to swing unevenly and make a grinding sound against the stone post that had settled since the summer. He had made a note of it. He made notes of everything, in a small, water-stained book he kept in his breast pocket, and had meant to ask Owen to see to it during the first dry stretch they got. But Owen had a bruised hand from a fence post incident in the paddock, and Bernard himself had been occupied with the Eastfield drainage work, and the dry stretches had been brief and poorly timed, and the hinge had continued to loosen in the way that unattended small problems always do, quietly and with great determination. On the first Thursday of December, the hinge let go entirely. It did not collapse dramatically. Nothing about it was dramatic. One of the 3 identical brown hens pressed against the gate at the wrong angle during the morning feeding, and the gate swung open with a smooth inevitability that suggested it had been planning this for some time, and the hen walked out as if she had expected it, followed immediately by 2 others, followed a moment later by Constance, who came out last with the air of someone who had long predicted this outcome. Elena had her back to the gate when it happened. She turned when she heard the noise of their feet on the stone path outside the yard, which was a different sound from the noise of their feet on the packed earth inside it, and she saw all 4 of them already moving with purpose toward the formal garden, which lay through a gap in the yew hedge, and which contained, from a hen's perspective, an excellent variety of interesting things to investigate and ruin. She went after them. She was not panicked. Hens were retrievable, and she had done this before, and she knew from experience that the best approach was patient, not rushed, because rushing caused them to scatter in different directions, which was worse. She went through the gap in the yew hedge at a walk, keeping low, using the same calm she used for everything, and began the careful work of redirecting the escapees back the way they had come. The 3 brown hens were cooperative once they worked out that the garden was not, in fact, full of grain. They clustered together near a dormant rose bed and looked at her with a slightly deflated expression, as if adventure had not delivered what they had hoped. She got them moving back through the hedge gap with modest effort. Constance was another matter. Constance had moved at speed toward the far end of the formal garden, where a large stone fountain stood drained and covered for the winter, with a board and a weighted canvas. She had positioned herself on top of the canvas cover, with an expression that said she considered this an improvement on her usual situation, and did not intend to be moved. Elena approached slowly. Constance watched her approach with focused suspicion. Elena stopped 3 feet away, and looked at her steadily. Constance did not move. Elena crouched down and extended her hand with nothing in it, which was not what Constance wanted, but which was the kind of gesture that sometimes convinced a stubborn hen that engagement was the easier option. She was maintaining this standoff, neither of them moving, the gray morning air very still around them, when she heard footsteps. She did not look up immediately. She was committed to the hen. But the footsteps were measured and calm, and came from the direction of the great house, and they did not stop at the edge of the garden, but continued toward her, and when she finally did look up he was 10 feet away, walking in the unhurried way he had, the same way she had seen him on the path in the rain, without urgency, without the particular self-consciousness of someone walking toward a situation they found amusing. He stopped a few feet from the fountain. He looked at Constance. He looked at Elena's extended and empty hand. He looked at Constance again. He said, "She does not appear to be persuaded." Elena said, "She is not easily persuaded by anything." He crouched down slightly, which surprised her, not because it was a wrong thing to do, but because it was the right thing to do, and she had not expected it. He extended his own hand, also empty. Constance transferred her suspicious attention to him, examining him with the same deep skepticism she applied to everything. He held very still. Elena said, very quietly, "She prefers to come to you rather than be reached for." He nodded, equally quiet. He held still. Constance looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She tilted her head with the air of someone conducting a thorough evaluation. Then she stepped off the fountain canvas and walked forward 3 deliberate steps and put her beak against his palm. He picked her up. He did it well, firmly, under the wings, supporting her weight. And Constance, with the magnificent inconsistency of bad-tempered creatures everywhere, settled against his coat with absolute composure, as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing. He stood up. He held the hen against his chest with one arm, and looked at Elena, who was now also standing, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, and the morning was very quiet, and his expression was the closest thing to open she had yet seen on his face. She said, "Thank you, I'll take her." He said, "I can carry her back, if you need to get the gate." She thought about this. She said, "Yes, thank you." They walked back through the gap in the yew hedge together, him with Constance held against his dark coat, her a step ahead, and the 3 brown hens following behind them, with the comfortable subordination of creatures who had already given up on today's adventure. The gate was still open and leaning. Elena held it steady with one hand, while he carried Constance back into the yard, and she shut the gate and looked at the broken hinge, and he stood beside her and looked at it too. He said, "I will have Owen see to it this morning." She said, "Bernard could do it." He said, "Bernard's hands are full with the Eastfield. This is a quick fix. I will tell Owen." She looked at the hinge. She said, "That is very good of you. Thank you, sir." He looked at her for a moment with that same small, almost smile, the one that was in the direction of warmth without quite arriving there. He said, "You can let go of the sir, if you like. It makes conversations longer for no reason." She did not know what to say to that either. She had noticed that he said things that she did not know how to answer immediately, things that were entirely reasonable, entirely calm, and yet which shifted something slightly in the arrangement of the air between them. She said, "Very well." He nodded. He looked at Constance, who was now inside the yard, and already pushing through the other hens to find grain she had missed. He said, "What is her name?" Elena paused. She said, "I call her Constance." He said, "It suits her." He turned and walked back toward the great house. She watched him go for a moment, not long enough to be watching, just long enough to note the way he moved, the same unhurried walk she had seen each time, as if the world could wait for him and he had decided to let it. She turned back to the gate. She checked the 3 brown hens, checked Pearl, who had not escaped at all and was looking at the whole situation with faint disapproval, and then she picked up the pail and stood in the middle of the yard and breathed out slowly. He had been outside, early, walking in the formal garden, which was not a place people walked to reach anything from the great house. It was a place you walked to be in, which meant he had gone there on purpose, or at least without a practical destination. She did not know how long he had been there before the hens came through. She did not know if he had seen her arrive at the yard from wherever he was standing in the garden. She stood for another moment. She let the cold air settle around her. Then she picked up the grain bag and went to refill the pail for the afternoon feeding, because the hens had been disrupted and were likely to be hungry earlier than usual, and because she was very good at putting one practical task in front of the next one when she needed to stop thinking about something. Owen fixed the gate hinge that morning, as promised. He came at 8:30 with his tools and worked quickly and without fuss, and when he was done, the gate opened and closed smoothly, and there was no grinding against the stone post. He mentioned, as he packed up his tools, that the Duke had come to him directly, not through Mrs. Hobbs, not through Bernard, but directly, coming to the stable yard himself and speaking to him in person about the gate, and asking him to see to it when he had a moment. He said this without any particular emphasis, but Elena heard the slight note of surprise underneath it. The Duke, apparently, was not the kind of employer who went around people. He went to them directly. She thought about this while she worked in the greenhouse that afternoon, carefully checking the moisture levels of the corrected bed, which Bernard had dressed with sulfur the day before. She thought about how much a person could be understood from small things, from the way they handled a bad-tempered hen, from the way they spoke to a stable hand, from the particular unhurried quality of their movements through a space. She had built a great deal from very little, she reminded herself. She had the rain morning, the formal garden morning, and this morning. 3 encounters, brief and mostly practical. She had 3 data points, and from them, she was constructing something that might be entirely her own invention. And yet. She pressed her palm gently against the soil of the corrected bed. The temperature was right. The color was better. Things could improve, if you gave them the right conditions, and then waited patiently without interfering. She was not sure if she was thinking about the soil, or something else. She suspected it was both. She was, she thought, a woman who had become very good at living inside practical metaphors, because practical metaphors were the only kind her mind would allow her to follow, all the way to their end. She put the thought away. She closed the greenhouse door behind her. She walked back to the cottage in the early dark of the December afternoon, and started the fire, and put the kettle on, and sat down at the small table, with a book she had been meaning to read for 2 months. She read 3 pages. Then she sat with the book open in her hands and looked at the fire. She thought about the way he had crouched down beside the fountain, unhurriedly, without self-consciousness, and held out his hand to a hen he had no reason to believe would come to him. The patience of it, the quietness of it. as if he had understood, without being told, exactly the right way to approach something stubborn and suspicious. She thought, he is very good at being still. Then she thought, so am I. She looked at the fire a little longer. Then she closed the book, set it aside, and went to make her supper, because the night was cold and she was hungry, and those were the only things that actually needed attending to right now. The letter began as a practical document. He knew this because he had intended it that way, had sat down at his desk on the evening of the third day after the incident with the hen, and told himself, quite firmly, that what he was going to write was a communication from an estate owner to a member of his household regarding a possible adjustment to her working arrangements. Nothing more. The phrasing alone was evidence of his intentions. Adjustment to working arrangements. He had even found the correct paper, the heavier cream paper, the kind he used for formal estate correspondence, the kind with the Aldenmuir letterhead, already printed at the top. He had not written a single sentence on it in 40 minutes. He had, instead, written 3 sentences on a separate piece of plain paper, crossed them all out, then torn the paper and started again. He had then spent time looking out of the study window at the dark grounds below, where the chicken yard was invisible in the night except for the dim, warm glow of the coop lamp, a small oil lamp that Elena kept lit on cold nights, he had been told, to help the hens stay settled. He had found himself thinking about this detail far more than it deserved. He got up, he walked to the fire. He stood with his hands behind his back the way he always stood when thinking, which was a habit Dorothy teased him about, because she said he looked, when doing it, like a man posing for a portrait that nobody had asked to paint. He thought about the morning clearly and practically, the way he tried to think about most things. Something had happened. He was not certain it was what he thought it was, and he was even less certain that his thinking about it was reliable, given the particular state of his interior life over the previous 3 years. He had spent a long time at the bottom of himself, and it was possible, more than possible, that the first thing to stir him back toward the surface would seem more significant than it actually was, simply because of the contrast. This was a reasonable position. He had always been reasonable, and he trusted reason the way some people trust instinct. He had built a life on it, careful, well-measured decisions made from good information. He had, in the reasoning department, served himself well. But reason had not prepared him for the specific quality of the 40 minutes he had spent sitting at his desk, failing to write a professional letter. He went back to the desk. He put the letterhead paper to one side. He took a plain piece of paper and he wrote, in his careful, upright hand, "I have been watching you." He looked at this for a moment. He crossed it out completely. He wrote, "I hope the gate is holding." He crossed that out too, because it was so transparently a pretext that even he could not pretend otherwise. He put the pen down. He laced his hands together on the desk and sat very still and thought about what he was actually trying to say, which was the harder question. He was trying to say, "I would like to speak with you again, not because there is a practical reason to speak with you, and not because our respective positions in the hierarchy of this estate make it natural or easy to speak with you, but because the 20 minutes I have spent in your company, across 3 separate mornings, have contained more quality of attention than anything else in the last 3 years, and I do not know what to do with that, and I am not entirely sure that what I am about to do is sensible, but I find that I care about this more than I care about sensible." He looked at the fire. He looked at the plain paper in front of him. He wrote, "I would be grateful if you would join me for a walk on Sunday, if the weather allows, along the lower field path." He wrote, "The walk would be entirely your choice to refuse, and I would not think less of you, or think of it at all, if you declined." He looked at both sentences. They were direct, without being improper. They were respectful. They expressed exactly what he meant, which was more than he could say for most of what he had written in the last 40 minutes. He picked up the pen to sign it. He held the pen over the paper for a long time. Then he set the pen down and folded the paper, not folded as in ready to send, but folded as in tucked out of sight, and put it in the breast pocket of his coat, which was hanging on the stand by the door, and he went to bed. He lay awake for an hour. He thought about the afternoon, not this afternoon, but an afternoon from 8 years ago, when he had done something similar with Clara, stood in a room with something unsaid, and tried to find the right door into the conversation. He had been afraid then, too, though fear had not been the right word for it even then. It was something more precise, a kind of awareness that the thing you wanted was real, and therefore could be lost, and the awareness of that possible loss was a kind of gift. It meant the wanting was also real. He had sent that letter 8 years ago. He had been 24 and it had taken him 3 weeks and 2 drafts, and Clara had received it and replied within the day, characteristically, with a note that said, "Yes, Sunday works. I will meet you at the gate, Clara." He smiled at the ceiling. He had not thought about that letter in a long time. He had not thought about it because thinking about Clara was still, after 3 years, the most difficult kind of thinking, the kind that carried weight. But this was not a heavy memory. This was a light one. The lamp at the window of her family's house, the feeling of the folded paper in his coat pocket, the particular relief of having finally committed to a thing. He thought, it is not wrong to feel this. It does not mean anything diminishes, it means something continues. He fell asleep with the unwritten letter in his thoughts, and the memory of a different letter folded under it, and for once, the house felt like it had the right amount of people in it. The letter stayed in his coat pocket for 4 days. He went about the days as he always did, the papers, the estate meeting with Jeffrey, the afternoon ride, the supper, the lamp in the study, the letters to his solicitor. He wore the coat on his morning walk and on his afternoon ride and was, he knew, carrying a folded piece of plain paper with 2 sentences on it, as if it were a thing of great practical importance, which it was not, or a thing of great personal importance, which it probably was. He took it out once, on the second day, in the afternoon. He read both sentences again. He put it back. On the third day, he added a third sentence. "I should very much like to know what you find to think about, standing in the yard each morning after the grain is scattered." He looked at this sentence for a long time. It was, he recognized, the most honest thing on the page. It was also the thing most likely to alarm a sensible person who had not been watching from a window for 6 weeks, and therefore did not know what context it belonged to. He crossed it out, and then sat with the crossing out, and felt, obscurely, that he had made an error. He put the letter back in his pocket. Mrs. Hobbs came to him that evening with something. She had been stopping by his study more frequently over the past 2 weeks, not because she had more to report, but because she was, he suspected, checking on him in the way she had for years, quietly, without comment, with the specific attentiveness of a woman who had worked for this house through several difficult periods, and knew that the worst times were not always the loudest ones. She set the tray down. She said, "I wondered, sir, if you had thought any more about the Christmas arrangements. Dorothy has written to ask about dates." He said, "Tell Dorothy she is welcome whenever she likes. She will come when she wants regardless." Mrs. Hobbs permitted herself a small smile at this, because it was true. She said, "And the staff? Should there be the usual gathering?" He said, "Yes, whatever we did in previous years." She nodded. She was about to go when he said, without fully deciding to, "What do you know about Elena Marsh?" Mrs. Hobbs had been with him long enough not to register surprise at unexpected questions. She considered for a moment. She said, "She is a very capable woman. She works harder than she needs to and complains less than she should. She has friends in the kitchen. Agnes likes her very much. Bernard thinks highly of her. And Bernard is not a man who thinks highly of things lightly. She reads. She had a difficult time of it before she came here, I believe. She seems to be," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "settled, as if she has found the shape that suits her." He absorbed this, he said, "Settled in the sense of content, or settled in the sense of resigned?" Mrs. Hobbs looked at him with the frankness of long familiarity. She said, "That is a question I could not answer. It may be both, the way it sometimes is with people who have been through a lot." He nodded. She took the tray and left. He sat for a while. He thought about settled. He thought about the shape that suits her, the phrase Mrs. Hobbs had used, which was a good phrase, an accurate phrase, because that was exactly what Elena Marsh appeared to have found, a shape. A quiet, functional shape that fit the life she was living, and required nothing beyond it. He was aware, in thinking this, that what he was contemplating, walking up to a woman who had found her shape and suggesting a Sunday walk, was the kind of thing that could disrupt the shape, and that if the shape was mostly contentment, disrupting it required a very good reason, and that if the disruption was unwelcome, the consequences for her would be more significant than the consequences for him, because the consequences for her would involve awkwardness within the walls of an estate she lived and worked on, with no easy distance to retreat to. He thought about this carefully and soberly, the way he tried to think about things that involved other people's lives, and not just his own. Then he thought about Sunday morning, the lower field, the long flat stretch of it, the winter grass pale and frost-edged, the sky that low white December sky. He took the letter out of his pocket, he read it again, he folded it again, he held it in both hands and thought about Clara saying, "Yes, Sunday works. I will meet you at the gate." He did not send the letter that night. But he did not burn it either. Sunday came cold and very clear, with a white winter sky, and the kind of bright, windless cold that makes the world look very sharp and very still. Elena was in the greenhouse in the morning, checking the corrected bed, which had responded well to Bernard's treatment, the yellowing retreating from the edges of the leaves. She was pleased about this in the quiet, practical way she was pleased when things worked. She was thinking about the lower field path. She had been thinking about it, on and off, all week. Not in an anxious way. She was not, by nature, an anxious person. But in the way that she sometimes thought about things she wanted to go and look at. The lower field path ran along the edge of the furthest field, where the estate met a stretch of common land, and in the summer it was bordered by long grass and wildflowers, but in December it was bare and flat, and you could see a long way in all directions, and she sometimes walked it on Sunday afternoons when she had the time. She had not been on it yet this winter. She had meant to go. She put the thought down and went back to the leaves. She left the greenhouse at 9. She had no particular plan for the morning, which was the one luxury of Sunday. No schedule, no assignments, just the general maintenance of the animals, and then time that was her own. She returned to the cottage and changed out of her work coat into her second coat, which was heavier but not as large, and which she wore when she was going somewhere, rather than simply working. She braided her hair. She pulled her boots on. She walked down to the lower field. She did not expect to find him there. The lower field path ran the length of the estate's furthest boundary, following the stone wall that separated Aldenmuir's land from the common ground beyond. It was a long, straight path that offered no surprises. You could see one end from the other on a clear day, and so she saw him before she was anywhere close to him. He was walking slowly, heading toward the common land end, with his hands in the pockets of his heavy coat, and his head slightly down against the cold. She stopped walking. She considered, briefly and without drama, whether to turn back. The path was long and empty, and there was no reasonable way to pretend she had not seen him. She had spent 2 years building a life on not pretending, and she was not going to start with a cold Sunday morning walk on a path she had as much right to as anyone. She walked on. He heard her footsteps at some distance. The path was frozen, and her boots were loud on it, and turned before she was within easy speaking distance, which gave them both a moment to recognize each other and adjust their expressions accordingly. His expression adjusted very little, which she had come to understand was not curtness, but simply the way his face worked at rest. She said, when she was close enough, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning. The path is better on the other side of the wall, if you have not been that way. The frost makes this surface uneven." She said, "I know it well. I have been going this way since the summer." He said, "I did not know that." She said, "There is no reason you would." He turned and they were, without having decided to be, walking in the same direction on the same path, which was not planned, but which felt, given the dimensions of the path and the cold, and the fact that there was no natural way to walk in opposite directions without one of them making an awkward ceremony of it, like the obvious thing. She noticed that he adjusted his pace, slightly, precisely, to match hers, which was a thing that people either did automatically or had to think about, and the fact that he did it told her something. She did not analyze what it told her. She filed it. He said, "How is the greenhouse bed?" She said, "Better. Bernard's treatment was the right one. The sulfur has cleared most of it." He said, "Good. Bernard is almost always the right one when it comes to that kind of problem." She said, "He is. He understands the land here specifically, which is different from understanding land generally." He looked sideways at her as they walked. He said, "That is a very good distinction." She said, "It took me a while to understand it. I came from a town. Everything I knew about land was general. Bernard has been patient about it." He said, "Where was your town?" She said, "Harwick, north of here, closer to the coast. Small. The wind was better there. Different kind of wind." He said, "I know Harwick slightly. There is a good church with a very ugly modern window someone added in the 1870s. She found herself almost smiling. She said, "On the south side. Yes. Everyone agrees about the window. No one knows who paid for it." He said, "Usually the people who pay for things like that prefer to remain mysterious." She said, "Usually, yes." They walked for a little while in silence, and she noticed this with some surprise, a comfortable silence. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who are in the same place, at the same time, without friction, which is a different thing entirely, and considerably rarer. He said, "Do you miss it, Harwick?" She considered the question properly, rather than giving the easy answer. She said, "I miss certain things. The sound of the sea at night. A woman I used to buy bread from, who had been making the same bread in the same shop for 40 years, and who always knew exactly what kind of week you'd had, from how you said hello. Small things." He said, "Small things are the ones you miss." She said, "Do you miss anything? From when you were away?" He was quiet for a moment. She had asked it without thinking, and felt briefly that it might have been too direct, too personal a question for a Sunday morning walk on a November path with a man she had spoken to 3 times. But he did not seem to find it too direct. He seemed, instead, to be genuinely considering it. He said, "I miss the mornings in Florence. The light there is different before 8 o'clock. Not better than here, just different. The quality of it. Very clear." She said, "I have never been to Florence." He said, "You would notice the light." She looked at him. She said, "Why do you say that?" He said, after a brief pause, "Because I think you are someone who notices things most people walk past." She did not answer immediately. The path ahead of them was straight and bright, with frost, and the sky above the far field was immense and white and very still. She thought about what he had said, and about what it meant that he had said it, and about the particular weight of being seen by someone who does not use words carelessly. She said, "I try to." He said, "It seems to come naturally." She said, "It took practice. I was not always paying attention." He said, "Neither was I." The common land boundary appeared ahead of them, the stone wall giving way to a wooden field gate. They both slowed as they approached it, not because either of them had decided to stop, but because it was a natural end to the path, and stopping there made sense. He put his hand on the gatepost and looked out over the common land, which was flat and wide and patched with frost. She stood beside him and looked too. After a moment, he said, "I had written you a letter." She turned and looked at him. He was still looking out over the common land. She said, "Had." He said, "Yes. I did not send it." She said, "What did it say?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It asked if you would take a walk with me on Sunday, if the weather allowed." She looked at the common land. She looked at the two of them, standing at the end of the path on a Sunday morning, when the weather had allowed. She said, "It seems to have worked out regardless." He turned and looked at her then. She looked back at him. It was the longest she had yet looked at his face at close range, and she catalogued it the way she catalogued things, carefully, without rushing. The careful eyes, darker than she had expected, the steadiness of his expression, that she no longer read as coldness, but as a kind of contained quality, as if there were a great deal happening behind it, that he had simply decided not to perform. He said, "I am glad you walked this way this morning." She said, "So am I." Neither of them said anything else. They turned, together, without deciding to, and began the walk back toward the estate. She did not sleep easily that night either. She lay in the narrow bed in the cottage, with the fire burned down to embers, and the cold of the room settling gently over everything, and she looked at the darkness above her, and let her thoughts go where they wanted to, which was something she rarely permitted on an ordinary night. She thought about the way his pace had matched hers without discussion, the specific weight of being told that she noticed things most people walked past, the fact that a letter existed somewhere in a coat pocket, unread by her but addressed to her, and the particular quality of care that represented, the care of a man who had thought about the right words, and then questioned whether using them was the right thing to do. She had been careful with herself for a long time. She had been precise about the difference between wanting something and being entitled to it, between noticing a person and pursuing a fiction about who that person was. She had kept herself honest about the distance between the little she knew and the larger stories the mind could build from it. But the little she knew had grown, and the larger story was beginning to feel, with each encounter, less like a story, and more like an accurate account of something real. She thought about what the kitchen maid Agnes would say. Agnes was a bright, warm, practical woman of 25 who had attached herself to Elena in a friendly, uncomplicated way, appearing at the cottage door on Sunday afternoons, sometimes with leftover cake, and a great many opinions about the lives of everyone on the property. Agnes would, Elena thought, react to this information with enormous enthusiasm and a very small ability to keep it quiet. She would not tell Agnes. Not yet. Not while it was still this small and this new, and had this particular quality of something that might break if it was not held carefully. She turned over. She looked at the dying embers. She thought about tomorrow morning, the grain pail, the cold, the hens, the yard. She thought about whether she would now approach the chicken yard differently, knowing what she knew, whether she would be self-conscious about the window, whether she would feel observed in a way that was uncomfortable. She considered this honestly. She thought, no, she would not feel uncomfortable. She did not feel observed, she felt. The word arrived with surprising clarity. Accompanied. Even at a distance. Even through glass. There was a difference, and the difference was intention, and his intention, she was beginning to understand, was not to take anything from her, but simply to be near something that, apparently, made the mornings feel different to him. She understood that. She understood it specifically. She lived it herself, every morning, in the quiet of the yard. She closed her eyes. Outside, the valley was very still, and the frost was settling across the grass in its nightly and dependable way, and somewhere in the great house, the lamp in the east wing study was probably still lit, and this thought, which she examined briefly before setting it aside, made the darkness around her feel not larger but smaller. She slept. Dorothy Wentworth arrived on the 15th of December, 2 days earlier than expected, having decided, as she always decided things, quickly, and without consultation. She came in a hired carriage with 2 trunks and her small brown dog, who was named something she changed regularly and was currently called Frederick, and she swept into the great house of Aldenmere with the particular energy of a woman who has been worried about her brother for 3 years and is trying very hard not to show it, while also, somehow, showing it completely. She was 45, 4 years older than Charles, and had the same dark eyes but a more expressive face. She had never, she told him once, been capable of his kind of restraint, and had made peace with this years ago by deciding that restraint was overrated. She was widowed too, earlier than him, and had rebuilt herself from it with a practical efficiency he admired deeply, and a cheerfulness he sometimes suspected was more determined than felt, though he had never said so. She found him in the library after supper on her first evening, reading in the armchair nearest the fire, with his boots off and his reading glasses on, which she considered a good sign, because it was the most ordinary human she had seen him look in several years. She sat down across from him. Frederick installed himself on the hearthrug, with the confidence of an animal who knows his place in every room. She said, "You look different." He said, without looking up, "Different from when?" She said, "From Vienna." He turned a page. He said, "I should hope so. Vienna was a long time ago." She said, "Charles." He closed the book. He took his glasses off. He looked at her with the steady, somewhat resigned expression he kept specifically for conversations his sister had decided to have with him. She said, "You look better. Not good, yet, but better." He said, "Thank you." She said, "What has changed?" He said, "I am home. I have work to do. The routine helps." She looked at him for a long time in the particular way she had. A way that had once made him, at 10 years old, confess to something he had been successfully lying about for a week, and which had not substantially lost its power in the 30-odd years since. She said, "Is there something else?" He said, "Why would there be something else?" She said, "Because you answered that question too quickly." He was quiet. Frederick shifted on the hearthrug and exhaled comfortably. The fire made its small, reliable noises. He said, "There is someone I have been spending some time with." Dorothy sat a little more upright. She said, with the careful calm of someone trying very hard not to overreact, "I see. In what sense?" He said, "In the sense of walking and talking. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that has been discussed or decided or named. She said, "Who is it?" He told her. He told her carefully and precisely, the way he told things. Elena Marsh, Bernard the grounds manager's niece, 31, capable, quiet, had been on the estate for 2 years. He watched Dorothy's face go through a series of very rapid adjustments during this telling. He saw the initial surprise. He saw it recalibrate. He saw her think. He saw her decide to think before speaking, which was a thing she did not always do and which he appreciated. She said, "I see." He said, "I know what you are going to say." She said, "You don't, actually." "I was going to say," she paused, still clearly deciding. "I was going to say that it is wonderful that you feel something again. That is the only thing I was going to say." He looked at her. He said, "But," she said, "but there is a great deal of complexity in the arrangement." He said, "I am aware of it." She said, "She lives on your estate. She works for your household." He said, "I am aware of that too." She said, "And she may not be in a position to—" She stopped. She said, "I don't mean this unkindly, Charles. I mean that the situation carries an inherent imbalance, and that imbalance matters, and the fact that you are a decent man who would not use it against her does not mean it isn't there." He said, "I know." She looked at the fire. She said, "Have you told her what you feel?" He said, "It is still very early." She said, "But she knows something is happening." He said, "I believe so, yes." She looked back at him. She said, "What do you want to happen?" He sat with this question for a moment. He said, "I want to know her. I want to have the kind of conversations we have been having, and more of them. I want—" He stopped. He said, "I want very much not to do the wrong thing." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That is the right thing to want." She picked up her book. Frederick sighed. The fire continued its quiet work. Outside, the grounds of Aldenmere were dark and very cold under a sky full of stars. The letter, which he had carried in his coat pocket for more than 2 weeks, had acquired a slight softness at the fold from being opened and closed so many times. He had read it again that morning, before Dorothy arrived. The 2 sentences were still there. "I would be grateful if you would join me for a walk on Sunday, if the weather allows, along the lower field path. The walk would be entirely your choice to refuse, and I would not think less of you, or think of it at all, if you declined." Below these, in a slightly different hand, written later, with a different pen, were the crossed-out words of the 3rd sentence, which was still mostly legible, even through the crossing out. He had crossed it out because it was too revealing. He had crossed it out because reading it would have told her exactly how much attention he had been paying to her, and that amount of attention might have alarmed her. He sat with the crossed-out sentence for a while. Then he took a clean piece of paper and a pen, and he wrote it out in full. "I should very much like to know what you find to think about, standing in the yard each morning after the grain is scattered." He looked at it. He added, "I ask because I have watched you from the window of the East Wing study, and I am aware that in writing this, I am confessing to a great deal, but I find I would rather confess it than carry it in silence any longer." He set the pen down. His hand was steady. The room was very quiet. He thought about Dorothy's question. What do you want to happen? He wanted her to know. That was what he wanted. He wanted her to know that the mornings were different now, and that the difference was her, and that he had sat at that window in the cold for nearly 2 months, and watched something ordinary, and found in it an extraordinarily personal kind of relief. He wanted her to know, not because it would necessarily lead anywhere, and not because he had mapped out the shape of a future and wanted to install her in it, but simply because carrying something alone for a long time is one kind of honesty, and saying it aloud to the person it concerns is a different and braver kind. He folded the new letter, this longer, more honest one, and set it on the desk beside the original. He looked at both of them. He thought, I will give it to her on Sunday. He thought, no, I will give it to her before Sunday. Because Sunday comes and Sunday goes, and then there is another week of mornings at the window, and he did not want another week of mornings at the window without her knowing why he was there. He thought, I will give it to her tomorrow. He picked up the longer letter and read it over once more. It was careful and honest, and slightly terrifying, the way all genuinely honest things are slightly terrifying. He put it back on the desk. He sat looking at the fire. He thought about Elena Marsh, standing in the cold yard after the grain was scattered, very still, with the hens busy at their breakfast around her. He thought about the particular quality of that stillness, the way it was not emptiness but presence, as if she were listening to something the world was saying at a frequency most people could not hear. He thought about the morning in the rain when she had looked up and found him on the path and had not looked away. He thought about Sunday, the gatepost, the long white sky, what it had felt like to walk beside someone at a matching pace, without either of them manufacturing the reasons to be there. He picked up the longer letter. He held it for a moment. Then he tucked it inside the original letter, folded them together, and held the whole thing in both hands. Tomorrow, he thought. Give it to her tomorrow. Whatever happens after that will be what happens. But let her know. Stop watching from the window. Stop carrying folded paper in coat pockets. Let her know, and see what she does with it, and then you will have the information you need to decide what comes next. He set both letters on the corner of the desk, where he would see them in the morning. He went to tell Dorothy good night. She was in the smaller sitting room, Frederick across her feet and a book across her knees, looking comfortable and at home, and entirely unsurprised to see him appear at the door. She said, "You look as if you've made a decision." He said, "I think I have." She said, "Good. Decisions are better than the alternative." He said, "The alternative being?" She said, standing at windows. He looked at her. She looked at him. The corners of her mouth were very carefully still. He said good night. He went back upstairs. He turned out the lamp in the study, which was something he had rarely done before midnight, and he stood for one last moment at the window, the lower grounds window, the one that looked down toward the yard, and there was nothing to see, only the dark and the frost and the faint glow of the coop lamp, as reliable as always. He let the curtain fall. He went to bed. The letter did not get delivered on Monday. On Monday, Jeffrey arrived at the house before 8 with urgent news about the drainage work in the East Field, which had hit a complication in the form of an old watercourse that nobody had documented, and which was now disrupting the plan significantly. He and Jeffrey spent the morning at the East Field itself, knee-deep in the technical details, and the afternoon, with the estate maps in the library, and by the time the light went and Jeffrey took his leave, the letters on the study desk had been present, but inaccessible for the entirety of the day, in the way that important things sometimes become inaccessible when the ordinary demands of a life close in around them. On Tuesday, Dorothy wanted to see the grounds. This was a reasonable request, and he was glad of it in the abstract, because Dorothy had not been to Aldenmere since before Clara died, and he had not yet walked the full property with her, and there was a great deal she should see and understand, including the East Field situation, which would affect the spring planning. They spent Tuesday morning on the grounds, walking from the upper gardens all the way down to the lower boundary. They went through the kitchen gardens. They went past the greenhouse, which was quietly busy with winter growth. They went along the wall of the formal garden, which was dormant but well maintained, the rose canes trimmed, and the paths cleared, and the fountain properly covered. At the edge of the formal garden he stopped. Dorothy, who had been speaking about the roses, stopped too. She was in the chicken yard. Elena was in the chicken yard, with the afternoon grain pail, doing the second feeding of the day. She was not aware of them. The yew hedge stood between the garden and the yard, and she was facing away, toward the far wall where the older hens preferred to scratch. She moved through the yard the same way she always moved, that steady, unhurried, purposeful way that he had spent 2 months watching from a considerable distance, and which was now 20 feet away and very clear. Dorothy was looking at him. He realized this and looked back at her. Her expression was careful and thoughtful and completely unreadable, which meant she was working hard at it. She said, very quietly, "Is that her?" He said, "Yes." Dorothy looked for a moment longer. She said nothing. She turned and walked back in the direction of the formal garden, and he turned and followed her, and they said nothing about it for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, when Dorothy had gone up early and the house was quiet, he went to the study and looked at the letters on the desk. They were exactly where he had left them. He picked them up and held them and stood by the window for a long time, not looking down at the yard, not watching, just standing, and thought about the particular difficulty of a thing that is not yet anything but could become something, and how that particular state of things is both the most fragile and, in a strange way, the most alive. He set the letters back on the desk. He thought, Wednesday morning. Before the day starts and before Dorothy is up, and before Jeffrey arrives with further complications, he would go out to the yard, not to the window. To the yard, where she actually was, in the actual world, and he would give her the letters, and then it would be real rather than potential, and whatever happened next would happen next, and he would survive it either way. He thought, I am not afraid of what she will say. He thought, that is not quite true, but I am more afraid of never knowing. He put the lamp out, he went to bed. He lay awake for a reasonable amount of time and then, unexpectedly, fell into the deepest sleep he had had in 3 years. Wednesday morning arrived with the specific quality of an English December morning that has decided to be beautiful. The sky, a hard, bright blue over the valley, the frost brilliant and sharp on every surface, the air so clear that the hills at the far end of the valley were visible with unusual precision. He was at the window, not the lower grounds window this time, but the other window, the one that looked down the valley, when the sky was still dark and the blue had not yet appeared. He watched the horizon and waited for it. She would be at the yard at 5:20. He had the letters in his coat pocket. He had put them there before getting dressed, in the same careful way he had put them in his pocket every other morning for 2 weeks without acting on them, and the difference this morning was that he was going to act on them. He had thought about how, he had realized, in the practical light of planning the actual thing rather than imagining it, that going to the chicken yard was different from meeting her on a path or encountering her in a garden. The yard was her space, in a real and particular sense. She came there before the estate was awake. She came there early, precisely because it was private. Going there, letter in hand, was the equivalent of stepping into her room. He had thought about this for a long time, and had not fully resolved it, and had decided that he would go to the yard but not into it, would stop at the gate and wait for her to come out, or call to her from the gate, or simply be there when she noticed him, and let her decide whether to come to the gate or not. This felt, if not entirely elegant, at least respectful. He held on to it. He went downstairs at 5. He put on his heavy coat over his coat. He had boots already by the door and he put them on, and then he went out into the December morning, which hit him with a cold so bright and specific that it almost made him laugh. He walked down the grounds. The frost was very loud under his boots on the gravel path, and he moved more slowly than usual to reduce the noise, which he was aware was slightly absurd and did not stop doing. He passed the formal garden. He went through the gap in the yew hedge. The yard was ahead. The coop lamp was still lit, just visible through the slats of the coop walls. The hens were not yet out. She opened the coop after arriving, not before. He reached the gate. He stood beside it without opening it, and leaned against the stone gatepost, and looked at the yard in the early dark, and breathed in the cold air, and was aware that his heart was doing something it had not done in years, which was not a medical concern, but rather a sign of being very thoroughly alive. He heard her coming before he saw her. Her boots on the frozen path, the quiet rattle of the grain pail. He turned toward the sound. She came around the corner of the outbuilding and stopped. They looked at each other in the dark December morning, 10 feet apart, the gate between them, the frost on everything, the cold air visible in both their breaths. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." After a moment she said, "You are out early." He said, "Yes. I wanted—" He paused. He took the letters from his pocket. He held them toward her across the gate. He said, "I wrote you something. Some time ago, in fact. I would rather you had it than not." She looked at his hand with the folded letters in it. She came to the gate. She took them from him with the same matter-of-fact directness she brought to everything, and held them without opening them. She looked at him. She said, "When you say some time ago." He said, "Almost 3 weeks." Her expression moved. Something shifted in it. Something that was not surprise but was in the neighborhood of something softer. She said, "Why did you wait?" He said, "I was not sure it was the right thing to do." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I am more sure that not doing it is worse." She looked at the letters in her hand. She looked at him. The sky above the valley was just beginning to move from black to the deep pre-dawn blue, and in that particular light her face was very clear to him, and he saw exactly the expression she was wearing, which was not readable in any simple way, but which was the expression of someone who is thinking carefully, and quickly, and with great seriousness, about something that matters to them. She said, "Can I open them now?" He said, "Please. If you want to." She opened the outer fold and read. He stood at the gate and watched the top of her head and the valley behind her, and breathed steadily. It took her perhaps 2 minutes to read both, and in those 2 minutes, he did the thing he had taught himself to do during difficult waits, which was to pay close attention to his surroundings, rather than to what he was feeling: the frost, the coop lamp, the sound of the hens beginning to stir inside, the bright particular cold of the morning. She folded the letters. She held them in both hands. She said, the third sentence. He said, yes. She said, you were watching. He said, yes. I am sorry. I did not know. In the beginning, I did not know who you were. And then I did. And by then the mornings had already become. He stopped. He said, I am sorry. That is all. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I knew. He looked at her. He said, you knew? She said, not immediately. But for a while now, yes. She paused. She said, I looked for the light in the window. He held very still. She said, I looked for it the same way you came to the window for the same reason, to see if someone was there. The hens in the coop were making the sounds they always made before release, the small, increasing murmur of creatures ready to begin the day. She looked at the gate between them, and then at him, and she opened the gate, and came out to his side of it, and stood in front of him in the cold morning, close enough that he could see the color of her eyes clearly for the first time. She said, what you wrote about the standing still after the grain. I have thought about it. I think about the things I need to do, and I think about the things I want to do, and sometimes I think about nothing at all. And in the past few weeks, she said, more quietly, I have thought about the window. He said, I am glad. She said, so am I. The hens began their noise, and the sky went on changing, from blue to gray, to the first cold suggestion of gold at the edges, and neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. Agnes found out before anyone else told her, which was typical of Agnes, and she found out not because Elena had told her, but because Agnes paid very close attention to the world around her, and had, in her 25 years, developed an accuracy of observation that she applied to other people's lives with the generous enthusiasm of someone who finds people genuinely interesting. She arrived at Elena's cottage on the following Sunday afternoon with leftover ginger cake and a face that was working extremely hard at being casual, which was, Elena recognized immediately, not Agnes's natural expression. Elena let her in. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the small table and looked at Agnes and waited. Agnes lasted approximately 40 seconds. Then she said, is something happening? Elena said, what do you mean by something? Agnes said, I mean the thing that is making you look different. Elena said, I don't look different. Agnes said, with great affection, Elena, you are smiling at the kettle. Elena looked at the kettle. She had not known she was doing this. She said, that is not evidence of anything. Agnes said, I have known you for 2 years, and I have never seen you smile at an inanimate object. Elena got the cups down from the shelf. She thought about what to say. She thought about the folded letters in the small box on her bedside table, where she had put them, because she could not decide on the right place to keep them, and the bedside table felt, in the meantime, like a place where she wanted them close. She thought about the mornings since Wednesday, the yard, the gate, the bright December cold, the gold at the edge of the sky. She said, there is a person I have been speaking with. Agnes said nothing. The quality of her silence said a very great deal. Elena said, it is early. It is complicated. I would ask you to keep it to yourself. Agnes said, I am the most discreet person in this house. Elena said, you are the least discreet person in this house. Agnes said, after me, I am the most discreet person. Who is it? Elena set the cups down on the table and sat back down in her chair and looked at her friend with the steady composure of someone who has decided that if anyone is going to know, it is better to tell them clearly than to let them fill in the gaps with guesses. She said, the Duke. Agnes put both hands on the table. She said, Elena. Elena said, I know. Agnes said, tell me everything. Elena told her enough. Not everything. There were things that were still too close to the surface, too newly formed, too entirely hers to share yet. But she told her the shape of it, the mornings, the path, the walk, the gate, the letters. Agnes listened with the specific intensity of someone who is genuinely interested and not at all performing it, which was one of the things Elena liked most about her. When she finished, Agnes said, "The letters, what did they say?" Elena said, "They said that he had been watching from the study window, that the mornings had been—" She paused. She said, "that the mornings had been better for it." Agnes said, "And you?" Elena said, "I told him I had been looking for the light in the window." Agnes was quiet for a moment. She said, with less of her usual brightness and more of something real, "That is the most quietly romantic thing I have ever heard in my life." Elena said, "It is very early, nothing is decided. I do not know what it becomes." Agnes said, "But you want it to become something." Elena considered this with the honesty she applied to difficult questions. She said, "Yes." Agnes looked at her. She said, "Be careful." Elena said, "Of?" Agnes said, "Of everything. I suppose. He is who he is. You are who you are. None of that is going to change, and all of it will be in the room with you every time you are together, whether you name it or not." Elena said, "I know." Agnes said, "And Mrs. Hobbs will notice, if she has not already." Elena said, "I suspect she has already." Agnes said, "And what about Bernard?" Elena said, "Bernard will know when I tell him. He will not ask before that." Agnes nodded. She poured the tea, because the kettle had finished and Elena had forgotten about it. She handed Elena's cup across the table and held her own with both hands and said, "I am glad for you. Whatever it is, I am glad." It was Bernard who came to him. He had expected this, though not so soon. He had expected, in fact, that it would be Mrs. Hobbs who would find a reason to broach the subject first. She was quicker to things than Bernard, more oriented toward the household's social interior. But it was Bernard who appeared at the back door of the great house on a Thursday morning and asked Geoffrey, who happened to be there reviewing the drainage plans, whether the Duke had a few minutes. He was in the library when Geoffrey brought the message. He said yes immediately and had Bernard shown in, which was an unusual arrangement. Bernard was not a man who came to the library, and which Bernard acknowledged with a slight awkwardness of posture that did not affect the directness of what he said. He said, "You'll know why I'm here, sir." He said, "I imagine I do. Sit down, Bernard." Bernard sat down in the chair across from him with the careful economy of a man who does not usually sit in such chairs and is aware of it. He said, "I am not here to cause trouble. I want to say that first." He said, "I know you're not." Bernard said, "She is not." He stopped. He tried again. He said, "Elena is not a person who—" He stopped again. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the carpet for a moment, and then looked up. He said, "She has had a difficult time of it, before she came here. And she has built something good and stable here, and she values it, and I want to make sure—" He paused, and his voice was very steady, and behind the steadiness was something solid and very clear. "I want to make sure that whatever is happening, it happens carefully." He sat with this for a moment. He looked at Bernard, really looked at him, the weathered face and the careful hands and the 30 years of loyal service in his bearing, and felt something that was both respect and something sharper, the awareness of being called to account by someone with the right to call him to account. He said, "I want that too." "You have my word on it," Bernard said. "She is a private person. Whatever she has told me is less than what has actually happened, because that is how she is. But she is different." He said this simply, as a fact. She is different, and I can see it from the outside even though she would not say so herself. He said, "Yes, I think she is." And he paused, and then said, "Because Bernard deserved the same honesty he had offered. So am I." Bernard looked at him for a long moment. He said, "She is not made for uncertainty. She can bear a great deal, but not uncertainty. She needs to know what things are." He said, "I understand, and I intend, as soon as I reasonably can, to be clear with her about what this is." Bernard said, "Good." He said, "Is there anything else?" Bernard stood up. He said, "No, sir. That was all." He paused at the door and then turned back. He said, "She told me once. She did not know I was listening, and I don't think she was talking to me directly. She said, 'At some point you have to stop building walls and start building rooms.' I think she was ready to do that before she knew that was what she was ready for." He said nothing in response to this, because there was nothing to say that would have been worthy of it. Bernard nodded and left. He sat in the library for a long time, with the fire, and the quiet, and Bernard's words in the room with him. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and went out into the December afternoon, to walk the grounds, because walking helped him think, and he had a great deal to think clearly about. The formal garden was bare and bright under the winter sun. He walked its path slowly. He thought about Bernard's phrase, "Stop building walls and start building rooms." He thought about Clara, who had been a room for him for 11 years, the room where everything difficult could be set down for a while. He thought about grief, which was what happened to a person when the room closes, and the ways you tried to rebuild the walls tighter afterward to make sure nothing else could come close enough to need closing. He thought about a morning in October, before he knew her name, standing at the window in the dark, and watching a woman scatter grain in wide arcs in the cold, and how something had moved in him then, something small and real and entirely unexpected, and how he had stood at the window the next day, and the day after that, because that small, real thing was the first thing in 3 years that had asked him to pay attention, and he had paid attention, and here he was. Here he was. He stopped walking. He was at the gap in the yew hedge, the one that led to the chicken yard. He looked through it. The yard was empty at this hour, the hens inside after the afternoon feeding, the gate closed. The yard was simply a yard, stones and packed earth and a wooden coop with a lamp that was not yet lit because the evening was not yet coming. It was, he thought, one of the most ordinary places he had ever found extraordinary. He went back to the great house. He went to the study. He sat at the desk and took out a piece of paper, and he wrote, not a letter this time, not something folded and carried and reconsidered, but a simple note, 3 lines, which he sealed and gave to Mrs. Hobbs that evening, with a request that it be given to Elena Marsh at the cottage. He asked that it be given directly, by hand, not left at the door. Mrs. Hobbs received this request with exactly the composure of a woman who has seen a great deal and is not surprised by any of it, and whose primary concern is that things are handled properly, which she could see they were being. She said, "Very well, sir. I will see to it tonight." He said, "Thank you." She left. He put the lamp on and opened a book and read until late, with a quality of attention he had not managed in years, which was to say, he actually read the words, and they meant something, and when he reached the end of a page he could remember what was on it. The note said 3 things. It said, "I have spoken with Bernard, and I understand what he has asked of me, and I intend to honor it." It said, "There is something I would like to say to you, which I have been assembling for some time, and which I believe you deserve to hear clearly and directly." It said, "Would you be willing to come to the house on Friday evening, at 7, for dinner? Dorothy will be there," which perhaps makes this less alarming than it might otherwise be. Elena read the note at the cottage table, with Mrs. Hobbs standing in the doorway, and managing with practiced dignity not to appear to be reading it too. She read it twice. She folded it and held it. She said, "Yes, please, tell him yes." Mrs. Hobbs said, "Very good. I will let him know." She left. Elena sat at the table with the note in her hands, and the fire at her back, and the cold December night pressing against the cottage windows, and she thought about Friday. She thought, "Something I would like to say to you, which I have been assembling for some time." She thought about assembling. It was a word chosen with care. Not something I have been thinking about, or something I want you to know, but assembling, as if the words required time and attention to be put together in the right order, as if whatever he was going to say was built rather than felt, constructed carefully and deliberately rather than impulsive. She understood this. She assembled things too. She had been assembling something since October, since the first morning she had looked for the light in the upper window. She had been taking pieces of him, the measured voice in the rain, the crouching beside the fountain, the matching pace on the field path, the honest line of the letter, and fitting them together with the careful patience of someone who does not want to build a wrong picture. She had put each piece in its place, and left space beside it for the pieces she did not yet have, the ones that would come if things continued, and she had looked at the whole of what she had assembled, and understood that it was not yet complete, but that the shape of it was real. She put the note with the letters in the small box on the bedside table. She lay down, not to sleep, but to think, and she let herself think about Friday, without filtering it first. Dorothy found out about Friday dinner from Charles over breakfast, and said, with very well-controlled delight. "You are going to be nervous all week." He said, "I am not." She said, "You are already nervous." He said, "I am not nervous." She looked at him over her toast. She said, "Charles, I have known you for 42 years. You are nervous." He said, "I am attentive to details." She said, "The same thing, in your case." She put the toast down. She said, "What are you going to say to her?" He said, "What I mean." She said, "And what do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I mean to tell her that what is happening between us, if it is happening, if she feels it too, does not need to be defined immediately, or rushed into, or made into anything before its time, but that I would like it to continue, and that I intend to conduct it as an equal thing, regardless of everything that says otherwise, and that I am aware of everything that says otherwise." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is the most grown-up thing you have said in years." He said, "Thank you." She said, "And if she feels it too, which, I should tell you, is obvious, what does that look like? What are you actually offering?" He said, "To begin with, more Sundays, more conversation, more mornings." Dorothy said, "And then?" He said, "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Friday came with snow. Not heavy. A thin, honest fall that started late in the afternoon and had settled into a light covering of white by the time the evening came. Elena walked up to the house at 5 minutes to 7 in her second coat and her good boots, which were not her best boots, because her best boots had a heel that was wrong for the state of the paths, and she walked through the snow-dusted grounds and looked at the lit windows of the great house and felt. She identified it precisely, clear. Not unafraid, not uncomplicated, but clear, as in, knowing what she was walking toward, and having decided that she wanted to walk toward it, and that decision being entirely her own, made with good information and a genuine understanding of the weight of it. Mrs. Hobbs met her at the side door, which was a small and thoughtful thing, not the servants' entrance, but not the grand front door either, the middle door, the reasonable door. She was shown through to the small sitting room, the one that was warm and not over-large, and Dorothy was already there, standing by the fire with a glass of wine, and the air of a woman who is trying to appear as if she were already going to be standing there, and not as if she were waiting. She was warm and direct, and asked sensible questions about the greenhouse and Bernard's sulfur treatment, and Elena found her easy company, which she suspected was both natural to Dorothy, and also deliberate, an attempt to make the room feel ordinary before the other person arrived. He came in at 7 exactly. He was in a dark coat, and he had taken the ink off his hands, which Elena noticed, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and Dorothy made an excellent show of noticing something interesting in the fire. He said, "You came." She said, "Yes, of course." He said, "I am glad." They had dinner. It was a good dinner. Mrs. Hobbs had arranged it well, simple and warm, and without the formality that would have made everything stiff. Dorothy talked enough to prevent silences from becoming heavy, and asked questions that drew Elena in, and once or twice left a pause that neither of them filled, because neither of them needed to. After dinner, Dorothy said she was tired, and excused herself with the efficient simplicity of a woman who knows when she is the third person in a room. They were left with the table and the fire, and their wine, and the snow, falling quietly outside the window. He said, "I would like to say the thing I wrote about." She said, "Then say it." He said, "I have been watching from the window since October. Not to intrude, or not only that. I watched because the mornings were very difficult to be in, after everything, and watching you made them less so. I don't know if you can understand what that means without knowing what the mornings were before, and I am not going to tell you all of that tonight, but I want you to know the weight of it. Because the weight is what makes this." He paused. He said, "I did not know if I was still capable of wanting something, and then I found that I wanted something, very specifically, and very clearly, and the specific, clear thing was more time in your company, in any form it could take." She looked at him. She said, "I have wanted more time in your company too." He said, "Good." She said, "I have also been afraid of it. I want to say that clearly, because I have built something here that works. And wanting something new is not the same as knowing it will not cost me what I have already built." He said, "I know. and I need you to know, and this is the most important part, that whatever this is or becomes, I will not allow it to cost you what you have built. If this ends badly, the cottage is still yours. Your work is still yours. Nothing that is yours here would be contingent on this. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You have thought about it carefully." He said, "I have thought about very little else." She looked at the fire. She said, "Bernard told you about the walls and the rooms." He said, "Yes. He also told me you would need to know what things are." She said, "He is right about that." He said, "I know what this is. On my part. I know it is early, and I know things change as you know people more, and I am not certain of the future, but I am certain of now, and now, I want to know you. I want Sunday walks, and conversation, and the particular quality of standing in the same space as you, without either of us needing to fill it. I want to give you time to know me too, which I am aware will require patience, because I am not a simple person." He said this last without humor and without apology, just as a fact. She said, "I do not need simple." He said, "No, I did not think you did." Outside the window, the snow continued to fall. The fire was warm, and the room was quiet, and the particular quality of the air between them was the quality of two people who have been very careful and very honest, and have arrived somewhere they had not expected to arrive, and are looking at it together. She said, "I have a question." He said, "Of course." She said, "In the mornings, before the letter, when you were watching, what did you think about?" He looked at her. He said, "I thought about the fact that you were completely at ease in a cold yard at 5 in the morning, that you didn't look as though you were enduring it. You looked as if it were the place you most wanted to be." She said, "It is." He said, "I know." And that was the thing that kept me at the window, because I recognized it. Wanting to be somewhere completely, without reservation. I had not felt that in a very long time, and watching you feel it. He stopped. He said, "It reminded me that it was possible, for a person to feel that." I had forgotten. She said, "And now?" He said, "I feel it about the window. I feel it about the path on Sundays. I feel it about this room right now." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "So do I." The snow fell. The fire burned. The house around them was the house of Aldenmere, all its weight, all its history, all its particular shape of grief and furniture and long corridors, and neither of them was going to pretend that any of that was simple, or that the days ahead would be uncomplicated, or that the world outside the sitting room would look at them without forming opinions. But inside the room, in the warm and honest quiet of it, there were two people who had both spent a long time standing at the edge of something they were not sure they deserved, and who had both, tonight, taken one careful and deliberate step toward the other. The next morning, he did not go to the window. He rose early, as always. He dressed before the light. He went downstairs in the quiet of the house, put on his coat and his boots, and went outside, into the white December morning, where the snow from the night before had frozen into a thin, bright crust across the grounds. He walked down the lawn. He crossed the formal garden, breathing the cold air in deeply, feeling the frost on his coat collar and the particular sharpness of very early winter mornings. He passed through the gap in the yew hedge. The chicken yard was ahead of him. The coop lamp was still lit, a warm gold point in the pale early dark. He could hear the hens inside, their beginning of morning sounds, the small noises of waking creatures. He opened the gate. He went in. He stood in the middle of the yard and was not certain what to do with his hands. He put them in his pockets. He looked at the coop. He looked at the yard, which was very quiet and very cold, and smelled of straw and earth. He looked at the stone wall and the frost on it, and the sky above, beginning its slow and reliable movement from black to blue to gray. He heard her footsteps, the grain pail, the particular sound of her boots on the frozen path, which he knew well by now from weeks of listening. She came around the corner of the outbuilding and stopped. He was standing in her chicken yard. He was standing in the middle of it, with his hands in his pockets looking at nothing in particular, with the same expression he always had, careful, contained, the face of a man with a great deal behind it, except that his expression this morning also held something else, something she had not seen before on it, a quality of being entirely, simply there, without reserve. She looked at him. She did not say anything. She came to the coop and opened the door, and the hens came out in their rushing, bobbing way, and they spread across the yard in search of grain, including across his feet, and he looked down at them with an expression of polite surprise. She gave him the grain pail without speaking. He took it. He looked inside it. He looked at her. She said, very quietly, "Scatter it out. Wide arcs. They'll find it." He nodded. He put his hand into the grain. He scattered it. He did not do it as well as she did. The arcs were narrower and the distribution uneven, but the hens did not care, and he scattered it again, and they moved around him in their busy way, and he stood in the cold chicken yard of Aldenmuir at 20 minutes past 5 in the morning, with the grain pail in one hand, and his other hand spread open and empty at his side, and the sky above was doing what the sky always did, turning, slowly, beautifully, from one kind of light to another, and he was entirely there. She stood beside him and watched the hens, and they did not speak for a while, and that was fine, and the morning was cold, and the yard was small, and the two of them were exactly where they were, which was a thing that had taken a very long time to arrive at, and which neither of them, now that it had, was in any particular hurry to move away from. Constance crossed the yard toward them with great deliberateness, and stood before him and looked up. He said, "Good morning, Constance." Constance regarded him. Then she turned and walked away, as if satisfied. Elena said after a moment, "She likes you." He said, "I suspected she was beginning to." She almost laughed. Almost. And then did. And it was the first time he had heard her really laugh. And it was not performative or polite, but genuine. A sound that came from real amusement. And in the cold morning air of the chicken yard of Aldenmuir, it was the most alive thing he had heard in years. He looked at her sideways. He was not laughing. He was doing something quieter than laughing, which was looking at a person and feeling, with complete and uncomplicated clarity, that you are glad they exist. She looked back at him. The light was coming up now, properly, the first gold of it over the eastern hills, falling across the yard, and the frost, and the busy hens, and the two of them standing in the middle of it. She said, "The mornings are better." He said, "Yes, they are." They stood in the yard while the light came up, and the hens found all the grain, and the cold wrapped evenly around them both, and Aldenmuir went on existing around them in its ancient, heavy, specific way, and none of that was simple, and none of it was certain, and both of them knew it, and both of them stayed,